The WHO's policy-making World Health Assembly convenes, with Chinese President Xi Jinping pledging $2 billion to COVID-19 response, along with a humanitarian crisis veto and a shared vaccine. Also, the hard lessons and biggest takeaways on pandemic control and experience of South Korea. And the G20 talks about measures to ease the pandemic-driven economic crisis, but China-U.S. trade tensions take a turn for the worse.
This involves a mixture of intellectual property, trade, and investment regulations that will have to be revisited in light of the experience of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei in Beijing. Today, we are focusing our attention on the very important World Health Assembly. As you may know, the World Health Assembly is the governing body of the World Health Organization. Today, it begins with teleconference. This time, its significance is much greater than the ordinary days with the backdrop of COVID-19 pandemic. But the question really is, can the world come together with solidarity against COVID-19? Can the world overcome the geopolitics and the collapse of economic sufferings to be able to work together on global health? After all, it is our health. Before an interview with a frontline doctor about all of this, take a look at this.
The 73rd session of the World Health Assembly has been slashed from 3 weeks to just 2 days. Ironically, during one of the modern world's biggest health crises, Chinese President Xi Jinping said it was crucial the meeting went ahead.
在人类抗击新冠肺炎疫情的关键时刻,
it is meaningful and critical to hold a meeting at this time amid COVID-19 pandemic. The virus has hit more than 210 countries and regions across the world. It has impacted 7 billion people. The disease has taken the lives of more than 300,000 people. I mourn the individuals who lost their lives to the virus. I also want to express my condolences to the families who lost their loved ones.
President Xi called on all nations to do more to bring the pandemic under control. He said China would continue to share its knowledge on the virus with the world.
经过艰苦卓绝努力,
after collective efforts and suffering great losses, China has turned the tide on the virus and has safeguarded people's health and livelihoods. All along, we have acted with transparency and responsibility. We have provided information to those in governance in the most timely fashion. We released the gene sequence as soon as it was available. We shared all information and knowledge with all relevant parties. We have given our best to support and assist other countries in battling the virus.
Xi made a few proposals near the end of the speech. First of all, he called on all parties to continue prevention measures, enhance testing methods, and to work towards developing a vaccine. Sharing information in a timely manner was also necessary to stop contagion. Secondly, he said the WHO should lead the global effort in fighting the virus. China will provide $2 billion in international aid over a 2-year period. Thirdly, Xi called for more assistance for African nations. 46 Chinese medical teams stationed on the continent have all joined the effort in battling the disease. Fourth, Xi said the global public health emergency response system needs to be enhanced. All parties should establish an efficient response mechanism in reaction to future events. Fifth, the restoration of economic and social development in an orderly fashion should be conducted under the guidance of WHO. Sixth, Xi said the outbreak has shown us that the world is a community with a shared future for mankind.
让我们携起手来，共同佑护
We will work together to safeguard the health and livelihoods of people around the globe. Together, we will work to protect the earth and build a public health community with a shared future for all mankind.
President Xi said China would continue its efforts to develop a vaccine. He said it would become a public health product to be used in combating the virus.
That's the latest on the ongoing World Health Assembly. The pandemic the collapse of the economy, and the geopolitics exacerbated by COVID-19, all of these cast a doubt over whether the World Health Assembly can be a success. But many argue around the world this must be a success. After all, it is the global health, our health, that we're talking about. The message is very clear from the frontline doctors. For example, Dr. Alice Kim Kam-tan, a frontline doctor coming from South Korea. Her argument is clear and loud. Let's listen. South Korea have managed to get the tests done, and particularly at the early stage, it was one of the countries that really standing out in this regard. And now later, of course, Germany is also doing it very well as well from the other parts of the world. How did you manage to do it with so many people, efficiently done? And what about the accuracy? What kinds of tests would you choose? There are a whole range of questions related to it. Dr. Tan.
So in terms of testing, we did have a little bit of good luck, I would say. In December, the Korean CDC ran a tabletop exercise for an unknown coronavirus. And so we had a little bit of a blueprint in terms of what would need to be done in case an outbreak happened. It was kind of fortuitous. And then we had a very quick emergency use approval for making domestic test kits, and we approved 5 companies right off the bat so that we can get domestic production of kits. And so we were able to ramp up the testing very quickly. In terms of the accuracy, the test is very accurate. PCR tests are very accurate, so they're very sensitive. They're good for initial diagnosis. One problem that we've had, I don't know if it's a problem, but when people who test positive, they're cured, they test negative, only to test positive again a few days later. And we've had more than 100 such cases, and it's been a little bit of a puzzle, but what we've concluded is that these people are not contagious. It's just dead viral fragments that are being picked up by the PCR test. That's how sensitive the PCR test is. So it's a very, the PCR tests that we're running, they're very sensitive. We are moving now to pooled sampling. In other words, we are testing large masses of people sort of all at once just to see if COVID-19 is in that population. And then we will probably do antibody community-based testing as well. That's in the plans. We haven't started yet.
It's very crucial, isn't it? But the question really is, as things continue to get worse, more people infected, more clusters of outbreaks, and probably the pandemic spread even wider, there's even more possibility of having complications related to the virus. So the important point, as they say, Dr. Tan, you know this much better than I do, is to make sure to control the spread of the virus and the disease. But obviously, in some countries, it's very difficult. You have seen the numbers. So what can we do now, Dr. Tan?
Right now, so there are countries that are now going into their uptick of cases. And I think the WHO is very cognizant of this. And so for countries that can help other countries get over or try to mitigate their rising cases, I think that's, in terms of global cooperation, that's something that needs to be done. There are places such as the United States where they had a huge epicenter in New York City, but the United States is a huge country, and there's still very free interstate travel. And so there can be spread and outbreaks in rural communities at any given moment. And so I think what needs to happen is people need to learn from the examples, the painful examples of other countries that have gone through this COVID situation, in the past, such as Korea, such as China. Learn from our examples and prepare now as much as you can in terms of the infrastructure, the testing, the isolation facilities. Remdesivir is a potential treatment It was approved for emergency use in the United States. And so that's a medication perhaps that should be, made available to the most severe cases to prevent death. There are a lot of things that countries can do because we know so much more about COVID-19 now than when it was first beginning in December and January.
Exactly.
So, there are a lot of measures that can be taken to limit the damage of COVID-19.
The price has already been paid. Don't let that price be paid once again. The other countries really need to know what's going on, what has gone wrong, what needs to be learned, and everything needs to be prepared. With the winter coming, Dr. Tan, how are you and your colleagues preparing, for all the possibilities and the scenarios? I mean, if I were you, I would have difficulty sleeping because there's just so many possibilities you have to work on in order to prevent further spread. But even if you work on them, it doesn't mean it wouldn't. So it's mind-boggling, absolutely.
So the first and most important thing is let's do what we can. So the first thing is make sure that everybody universally gets an influenza vaccine this year, without exception. So we want to be able to eliminate sort of the confounding factor of influenza into the winter acute respiratory illness scene. The next thing that we're doing is we're preparing acute respiratory illness screening centers throughout the country. They're going to be both in the private and the public sector. These are going to be freestanding. So if a person has suspicion, they have fever, cough, symptoms of an acute respiratory disease, rather than going into a clinic or a hospital where they have the potential of spreading their illness, we are going to be setting up these freestanding centers that are very easily accessible, that will have X-ray capability and testing capability, monitoring and triage capabilities, so that we can catch the cases early. In addition, we have already established a very robust public health system in terms of testing, tracing, tracking, isolation, and so those will all have to be mobilized. We do realize, however, that there may be a shortage of ICU beds, like there were when we had our Daegu outbreak, and so we are working now on preparing more negative pressure isolation beds in the ICU, and we're also talking about building a dedicated infectious disease hospital. Hopefully it will be ready by this winter.
Another thing I want to ask you, of course, is about international cooperation. You earlier mentioned some part of it, but let me go more specific. Dr. Tan, about the region, Northeast Asia. Now, we were, in your words, in the fire first, and we apparently came out of fire also quite early. So now, 3 countries, China, South Korea, Japan. What can we do despite of clusters of outbreak? General situation is still quiet. So what can we do? Is the possibility to have partial normalcy in terms of traveling, interaction among the 3 countries? I don't know. I want to ask for your professional opinion.
That's a really good question. I think the first 2 countries to start that in the Western Pacific region would probably be New Zealand and Australia, because New Zealand has done such a great job, and Australia has also gotten their COVID-19 situation under control. It may spread to, as you said, Korea, China, Japan. However, I would like to see the situation calm down a little bit more in Japan, also in Korea, before we start opening our borders. Our borders are open to trade. They're open to exchange of ideas, just not to international travel quite yet. I think it is a little bit early, but it is something that we can think about in terms of when we do open up our economies more, are we going to allow travel, and rather than traveling extensively to, say, the U.S. or to Europe, perhaps regional travel will be allowed. I think Jacinda Ardern talked about expanding our bubbles of travel in a staged manner as a way of managing COVID-19. So that is something to consider.
We'll see how things are. Coming week, we're likely to see the World Health Organization having its annual meeting. Now, this is very important, and this year couldn't be more important. So, as a doctor on the front line, who I've been talking to on and off many times, Dr. Tan, what do you think are some of the priorities? Now, the World Health Organization as the platform internationally to work on with all its member countries. And to you, what mattered the most as a frontline doctor?
So the World Health Organization, they are organizing what's known as a solidarity trial, looking at potential therapeutics for COVID-19. And this is happening on a global scale with resources being poured in that at an unprecedented level. So as the coordinator of this trial, they're playing a very important role. They're also playing an important role in coordinating trials for vaccines. They are also, of course, surveying the pandemic throughout the world, identifying hotspots, identifying countries that need more help, that need more resources, and making sure that the resources are allocated correctly. And so they play such an important role, and they're providing guidance. They are getting all of the information every day, and in terms of research, in terms of epidemiology, and they're making it known to the public. And so I am looking forward to hearing what goes on in that conference, and hopefully they will be able to give us some insight as to what to expect in the future.
Yes, indeed. And lastly, before we go, there are so many debates about, the virus origin, and which country should do what. What do you make of it? I mean, sometimes this is a war of words that we have seen every day in the front line. Does not help us to cure any disease, does not save any children. Dr. Tan, what do you make of those things that are always in the highlight every day?
I think they are quite unfortunate. I think, as I said, they are distracting us from the one true enemy, which is COVID-19. And we can't afford to have distractions.
No.
The most important thing now is, how do we prevent death? How do we manage this disease so that it causes the least amount of impact to our society? And having these debates about where did it originate, it really doesn't help the situation.
Dr. Tan, how can we wake them up?
How can we wake them up?
How can we wake them up?
So I talk about closed loop communication. So the public health experts have been talking about COVID-19, from the beginning. But it seems that the public did not receive the message, the intended message. And so I think as public health officials or doctors, people in healthcare, we can't just say, okay, well, we told you so, and then leave it at that. We need to make sure that we close the loop and that our message has the intended effect, the intended result. And we need to follow through and make sure that that's the case. And if we need to use ambassadors, spokespeople that the public can relate to, sports stars or celebrities, I think we need to do that. We need to use whatever means necessary to make our communication more effective. We need to make sure that we combat any infodemic that's going on, any false information. We need to make sure that that is cut off. And communication is so key, because the public, every single person, needs to be on board. And so the government, everyone, the public health officials, and then ordinary citizens, they all have to be unified in this effort to combat COVID-19.
Dr. Alice Tan, always my utmost respect for you and your colleagues who are making these efforts you just mentioned every day, every minute. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
That's the frontline doctor coming from South Korea. The message is loud and clear. As she indicated, at this time of global pandemic, we should put the scientists, the researchers, and also the health officials front and center, while politicians and the governments should be behind them and provide all the support. You're watching World Insight with me. Coming up in our program, later, I talk with a trade expert about how trade and investment can and must support a global fight against the COVID-19.
This involves a mixture of intellectual property, trade, and investment regulations that will have to be revisited in light of the experience of the COVID-19 pandemic.
This is World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. Over the weekend, the trade and investment ministers coming from G20 economies gathered and put forward their statement suggesting about the united role against COVID-19. Measures include a short-term effort to lift the coronavirus economic gloom and a long-term goal to support WTO reforms and multilateral trade. They also seek to firm up global supply chains and shore up international investments. But the Trump administration moved to block global chip supplies to blacklisted telecom company Huawei over the weekend, which is considered as another worrisome setback. So where does all of this lead us to? Can trade and investment help to save lives or block the way? I asked those questions to Jeffrey Schaub from Peterson Institute. You've been working and following very closely China-U.S. trade conflict recently. Tell me more about the decision made by the U.S. side to blacklist Huawei and China's response. What does that mean?
Well, it means that the fears that we had last year are coming to pass, that bilateral relations are becoming more difficult, and this is being exhibited not only because of the continuation of the trade tariffs from the trade war, but also on restrictions on investment, particularly in the high-tech sector. And we were worried about that deepening. It has affected very dramatically Chinese investment in the United States, and the new measures introduced are designed to restrict the flow from the United States of technologies and products that can be shipped directly or indirectly to China.
There is supposed to be a 120-day grace period. What would we be able to do in order to even take back the spilled water?
Well, these measures affect both Chinese firms and U.S. firms. And so there is a lot at stake. Right now, the White House seems to be making its decisions based on national security considerations that have not been fully vetted with the public. So it's hard to make an assessment of their actions. But there is an opportunity for firms to go and seek either exceptions or modifications in what is still today an interim rule. So it is in place, but it is temporary and can be modified. And hopefully for both commercial and political reasons, it will be.
At this point, though, we are seeing the pandemic still spreading and causing great concern in the U.S. Do you think American businesses will be able to be, up on their feet, be able to fight for their own interests, even though this is more targeting on Huawei, but certainly going to have a big impact on both sides?
Well, the political context has become much more complicated. And especially as we are only months away from a presidential election, And President Trump seems to be putting more and more emphasis on his criticism and opposition to Chinese practices to differentiate himself from Vice President Biden. It doesn't look favorable for a dramatic improvement in U.S.-China relations in the coming months because, frankly, the term in the United States is China has become a political football in the election campaign. And President Trump will use the concern and the fears about Chinese competition to try to win votes for his reelection.
Is there a way of so-called taking back the spilled water to manage the damage at least before the election so that things could be a bit better after it?
Well, we do need to manage the damage that is being done because we both need to work together to deal with both the consequences of the pandemic and the preparations that will be needed to prepare for the next iteration of crises that will come in this area. Obviously, international planning was not sufficient, both in both our countries and in the World Health Organization. And we need to work together to ensure that there aren't disruptions in needed production and supply, distribution of needed medical equipment and medicines. It will be particularly important to work together, hopefully when we have developed a vaccine, to ensure that the vaccine is available to all our peoples and can be distributed around the world to some of the poorest countries of the world. Because a global pandemic will come back and hurt the United States and hurt China if we don't control it everywhere. And so it is critical that we engage in the type of global cooperation that seems to be increasingly difficult as political rhetoric escalates in our bilateral relations. And that's something we have to worry about because it is inconsistent with the needs of that have been voiced by the G20 for global competition. That's something we have to keep in mind even as the United States goes through its presidential election campaign in the coming months.
Talking about the G20, Mr. Schott, you know very well over the weekend the G20 investment and trade ministers put out eventually a statement which is supposed to be applauded by everybody because it's been through a lot of hard work. Do you think there's much that we should really look into? I know you've been writing articles and been talking about the expectations people should have from these ministers.
Well, I think the ministers this week went a little further than was done in March when the ministers and the G20 leaders got together to address the immediate crisis caused by the pandemic. At that time, did little more than agree that they would continue to do what they were already doing and that they could continue to exercise their rights under the World Trade Organization to restrict imports or exports if it was absolutely necessary and was temporary. But what we have found out since then is that's not enough. There needs to be greater certainty that trade and investment will not be interrupted, that production will be encouraged, and that the supplies of needed medical equipment, therapeutics, medical supplies will be available both at home and abroad, because we need to deal with this pandemic both within our own borders and in our neighbors and trading partners, because we know that the transmission of the virus goes out and can come back in. And so that's why the G20 had to go beyond what it did 2 months ago. It made a small progress in that area.
In that statement, they talk about two things. One, of course, is short-term, as you just illustrated, how to coordinate, cooperate, and mitigate the impact of COVID-19 related to trade and investment. And longer term, it's about a reform of the WTO, the necessary discussions about that. But even for the short term, Jeffrey, let me go a little bit further about it. We have seen confusions as a result of different standards, even about the PPE, for example, and also the difficulties of the aviation industry relating to the shipping of goods to the necessary parts of the world, and to see the relation between contractors and also those manufacturers been changing as situations evolve every day. So these are all complicated issues. How can the ministers or the different bodies be able to coordinate on all of these very important details?
Well, it's difficult because they're dealing in a national political context and they're dealing with international necessities and relationships that have to be maintained in order to have the cooperation needed to source the supplies that are so important for national production. What we found in the United States is we couldn't block sales of certain medicines and pharmaceuticals because needed components to produce those pharmaceuticals in the United States came from other countries, and they would block our access to those goods if we restricted their trade. What we have to find is a better way of ensuring that there are adequate supplies and much greater stockpiles of these of medical equipment and medicines than we had before, because we know that a pandemic like the COVID-19 creates a massive strain on health systems in our countries and worldwide. So that's what the G20 should be doing. They should be renouncing the use of export controls and rather find a way of working together to ensure that there are incentives to ramp up production when it's needed and do it on a very urgent basis.
While the trade conflicts go on, the fate of the World Trade Organization, or WTO, is becoming ever more unpredictable, particularly with its Director General resigning 1 year before his term comes to an end. Roberto Azevedo, the WTO Director General, has been a proponent of international cooperation. Since late last year, the WTO's operation has been severely compromised because its appellate body has been crippled by the Trump administration, which refused to approve nominees to fill vacancies on that crucial appeals panel. So, what's at stake? I asked Jeffrey Schott about that question too. Let me move on to another topic about the WTO. The Director General of the WTO, Azevedo, have expressed that he will resign 1 year before his term comes to an end, out of frustration that the WTO will not be able to do anything, and there are a lot of geopolitical fights behind the scenes. Tell me more, Mr. Schott, about what does that mean for the immediate future of World Trade Organization. Can they still function?
Well, the World Trade Organization is a member-driven organization, so the Director General and the Secretariat act as basically serve the member countries. That said, they can provide very important guidance and leadership to promote constructive negotiations between the member countries and to ensure that existing agreements are adequately implemented and enforced. And I think what Roberto Azevedo has concluded is that with the blockage of the appellate body, which has essentially been disabled since the end of last year, with no prospect for big negotiations between the member countries, in part because of political frictions between major trading nations, and the pandemic, which makes it very difficult for trade negotiators to get together even virtually to build the type of foundations for new agreements. So we've seen the international WTO subsidy talks on fisheries basically stalled in recent weeks. Mm-hmm. All of this means that he wouldn't have had much to do. And the process for selecting his successor would have started later this fall in any event. So his decision to resign only pushes up 4 or 5 months the process that would have started in selecting a new Director General that would take office in September 2021. Essentially, in the interim, until a new Director General is selected, the Deputy Director Generals will guide the Secretariat in the limited tasks that they still have ongoing. One of the reasons why Acevedo felt it was important to leave a little earlier is to hopefully get a new Director General named by early next year, so that he or she, probably she, could be intimately involved in the preparations for the next WTO ministerial, which has now been moved back to June of 2021. And so I think that was one of his considerations, and I suspect that members will, WTO members will try to select a new Director General by the end of this year, possibly.
And finally, Mr. Shah, as we speak, the World Health Assembly is ongoing on Monday and Tuesday with the WHO and its member countries involved. How do you think it is likely to be more intertwined, the nature of trade and the nature of public health, as a result of COVID-19 and the uncertainties it's still having on our lives? People talk about the second, third, and even more waves regarding the virus. Mr. Shah.
That's a very good question. And actually, the WTO has had a long-standing debate and work on access to medicines. And this has been going on for almost 2 decades. And it's the COVID-19 pandemic just puts a spotlight on the need to move forward with that work, which has not progressed very quickly. It involves both the issues of intellectual property and the ability not only to patent, but also to broadly license new medicines and therapeutics, so that not only the home country, but also many other countries can produce and distribute the goods where the products where they are needed to deal with the pandemic. This involves a mixture of intellectual property, trade, and investment regulations that will have to be revisited in light of the experience of the COVID-19 pandemic. And the trade and financial officials who are dealing with the commercial side of the story need to be well informed by the medical experts, the epidemiologists and the virologists who understand what needs to be done to have a secure action or to remedy the pandemic. That's going to take some time, but the major trading nations really need to get together now, and the G20 is only scratching on the edges of what needs to be done to integrate the intellectual property, the access to medicines issues more broadly, and the trade and investment rules to ensure that they work more seamlessly to ensure access to medicines and proper sufficient production of those medicines and adequate distribution to all countries, rich and poor.
Well said, Mr. Schott. related to that final question, this seems to be what you have just said, an opportunity of cooperation. How optimistic are you in terms of whether we are going to grasp this opportunity to cooperate, led by the scientists, led by the epidemiologists, and led by the virologists, and of course the trade officials?
Well, I think you're seeing a great improvement in that cooperation among most countries in the world. And the area of problem remains because of the friction in the U.S.-China relationship that has been caused by the trade war of the past couple of years. I think what we need is a recognition that dealing with this virus is more important, and finding ways of working together to stomp it out is more important than some of the trade frictions that we've had that have been the subject of so many of your programs and so many headlines. But I'm not confident that that's likely to happen as we ramp up a presidential campaign in the United States that seems to be moving to much more negative rhetoric and much more China bashing like we saw earlier in the Trump administration. So I wish I could be more optimistic, but I suspect we're not going to see an improvement in U.S.-China relations that is needed in the near term, and hopefully after the election we can have a resetting of that relationship.
Jeffrey Shaw, always a pleasure having you on the program. Thank you so much for your insights.
Thank you for inviting me.
My interview with Jeffrey Shaw from Peterson Institute. That's all we have for today's program. If you would like to see more, certainly search us on the internet. Meanwhile, you can also follow us on YouTube channel, our Facebook and Twitter accounts. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of the team, thanks for watching. See you tomorrow.